a escuchar a Jackson Miller, que también tiene una presentación.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Buenos tardes. My apologies for my broken Spanish. I'm going to keep this in English. I hope that's all right. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., where I manage a conservation foundation. But I'll be moving to Cambridge to start a master's program at Harvard in the fall. But my work here today really speaks to my time managing research in Washington, D.C. That should inform law enforcement agencies, both in the U.S. as well as foreign deployed attachés all over the world who seek to map, track, and expose the transnational criminal syndicates who are trafficking illicit natural resources out of the African continent by exploiting licit systems of trade and finance. My portfolio highlighted elephant ivory, minerals, rhino horn, and in particular timber. Now, if you're here today, we're all hyper aware of the High Court of France's decision to sentence Vice President Théodorin in absentia to 3 years in prison, as well as his fine of 30 million euros, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars of luxury asset forfeitures, right? So we don't need to necessarily dig into that luxury. We're all aware. So what I seek to do today is place this work, place this work, bless you, in a global context, particularly because when it comes to timber rather than oil, demand especially for rapid urbanization and construction, not only across the African continent, but also in Asia, that demand is not going away anytime soon, right? And especially as oil, as an outlook for a lucrative commodity, is increasingly destabilized, timber might actually play or replay a more prominent role in the way Equatorial Guinea seeks to diversify its economy, but also maintain access to certain global markets. So you can see here, obviously in 2015, oil, highlighted in blue, represents a vast majority of foreign exports, whereas right before oil was on-streamed in the mid-1990s, timber was actually the most prominent foreign export point. And really today, the reason why I focus on Asian actors in particular is simply a response to the notion of the economic center of gravity, highlighted by McKinsey as a measure of economic intensity, if you will, is shifting more eastward, right, rather than westward. Although I'm particularly interested in not only its eastward shift, but its southward shift to the African continent as well. So really, the objectives today are to really gauge the extent to which the Equatorial Guinean state can leverage its remaining timber resources as a means to globalize or diversify its economy across both licit and illicit spaces, right? Because particularly the variegated nature of the timber supply chain, right? It's not only about accessing the land and extracting the resource, right? It's also about transporting that commodity. It's about clearing it in bulk quantities out of the maritime ports. It's about importing it, it's about shipping it, it's about selling it to consumer retails. That invites a really diverse set of skills, but it also invites a huge swath of opportunities for both listed and illicit actors to capture for arbitrage, right? Because the value of timber increases exponentially the further away you get from the forest. So really what this analysis seeks to do is walk us through that supply chain. So it pairs up supply chain analysis with social capital analysis to investigate a concept that was obviously heavily inspired by Dr. Appel, so I'm depressed that she's not here today. But a notion that I'd like to coin sort of criminal enterprise modularity, and what that is essentially it's a measurement on how a specific economy's social, financial, and political capital and operations can essentially be decomposed and reconstructed in response to a dynamic matrix of political and economic opportunity that simply rejects the bounds between licit and illicit spaces, right? So really there's three sort of segments of the timber supply chain that I would like to highlight today. Number one is authorization, right? How do you actually get that regulatory permission to access the land and access the resource itself? And we'll be looking at several high prominent East Asian business magnates as case studies. And then number two, transportation, right? So you cut some wood, you process it, you have several tons at your disposal, but it's still sitting in Congo Basin forests. How are you going to get it out? Right? That's a different set of skills. And so what we're going to look at today is the role of non-state militarized actors, or at least the exposure of them to Equato-Guinean timber forests. And finally, destabilization, right? Sure, this might be another way for, or timber might be another way for Equatorial Guinea to diversify its economy, but what about in the context of an increasingly dramatic outlook for North Korean politics from the President of the United States? What about the North Korean actors that have been operating in Equatorial Guinea's timber forests for decades at this point? So let's get to it. So first, authorization, right? So we're talking about building the capacity for that awe-striking capitalization, that awe-striking capital accumulation that manifested in that crystal glove on Teodorin's hand, as well as his paintings, his mansions, and whatnot. Obviously, it's a pay-to-play game, right? Oh, sorry, guys. So what we have here is a list of timber concessionaires as of 2013, obviously a bit out of date, but this is from the Congo Basin Forest Atlas, digitized by the World Resources Institute in Washington. And what we see, obviously, is the most prominent company being Shimmer, a local subsidiary of the Malaysian multinational Rimbadan Hijau. Now, even on documents released by the High Court of Paris, they even list Shimmer explicitly as paying a separate tax either to Teodorin himself or to his timber firm, Somagi Forestal, that more likely than not exists only in name, right? It's a pay-to-play game, and that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. However, a more interesting narrative is the Chinese and Hong Kong-based firms, right? And this speaks to, oh, sorry guys. Oh, I guess that slide was deleted by myself, my apologies. Anyway, so really there's another narrative, the narrative at play here, and that's the role of Chinese and Hong Kong-based actors, primarily Vic Wood himself. So Vic Wood is a Hong Kong-based timber magnate who was essentially one of the first people to actually establish Chinese-foreign joint ventures when the Chinese economy opened itself up to the rest of the world under Deng Xiaoping, under that whole reform and opening banner. Before that time, he actually built a multi-million-dollar business in Indonesia, Australia, and the Philippines. And so he was invited by the Chinese government to essentially be a mentor to fellow compatriots, but also to access what is and remains to be the world's largest consumer market today. In the mid-1990s, how he got to Equatorial Guinea, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, but his entry into the Equato-Guinean timber market was around the same time when John Bennett was most vocal about corrupt elections in the mid-1990s. And so Vic Wood, at least sources may suggest, that he might have been invited by certain state entities from the Chinese side to kind of go in and to broker some deals with Obiang himself. And he had personal meetings with Obiang as well as his compatriots for several years and established an array of subsidiaries that still are operating in Equatorial Guinea today. So the case of Vic Wood is interesting because he's not a government official, and yet he's been able to leverage a kind of symbiotic relationship between his own private individual capital as well as the priorities of the Chinese state, right? Number one, how will the Chinese state maintain its global growth? And that requires securing access to certain timber markets to fuel construction booms as that country continues to urbanize at the fastest rates that anyone has ever seen. And on Obiang's side, right, not only is Vic Wood coming in with access to the upper echelons of Chinese political power, he's also coming into this space as someone with bona fide experience creating thousands of jobs at a time from his management in the Philippines and Australia, as well as someone who can at least claim a capacity to build educational opportunities through his work in global philanthropy as well. So at least even if none of those opportunities take form, at least the projection still remains sound, right? So apart from just the authorization, right? Now let's look at, from what I find most interesting, is the transportation. That's a completely different ballgame, right? And what I like to highlight here is the sort of exposure to global terror and also non-state militarized actors. Now, watchdog NGOs based in Washington, D.C., particularly Global Witness, as well as the Sentry and C4ADS, my former employer, have highlighted the role of essentially how terror financiers, particularly those tied to Lebanese Hezbollah and the Amal movement, have basically diversified their portfolio to include timber, moving timber and the profits that come from that resource as a way to diversify and launder funds back into Lebanon and back into operations across the Middle East. Watchdog NGOs in Washington, D.C., and I've worked on this tangentially through my former analyst, they've highlighted a family case called the Tajidines. So the Tajidines are a group of sanctioned global terror financiers out of the U.S. that currently operate in the DRC with close ties to the Kabila family. They've been able to diversify their portfolio that previously included diamonds and construction and foodstuffs in the Gambia, Angola, and Sierra Leone to timber out of the DRC. Why? Because simply no one's looking. No one has this perception of timber as a resource that's tied to conflict. And really that perception makes sense because, as you can see, we're all exposed to timber resources on a daily basis, right? Timber itself has a low weight to value ratio. It's not like a diamond where I find a little chunk or I find a few carats and all of a sudden I'm rich. You have to ship that in bulk quantities to make a profit. However, in the African context, the way and what makes these networks particularly interesting is that you won't necessarily see members of certain Lebanese diaspora communities have formal positions in entities like Hezbollah or the Amal movement, right? You're not going to see the general. What you might see are simply family or clan networks who, on their own time and out of their own pockets, might simply donate a chunk of their income, again, on their own, to the extent that they can, out of their own decisions. And so these donations, if you will, aren't necessarily illegal, right? Anyone can donate to a cause that they find value in. But what this does reflect is a way to untether these financial exchanges away from licit or economies that are recorded on the book, if you will. And particularly the clan politics that resonate in the DRC, I'd like to argue that capacity exists in Equatorial Guinea today. So there's three families that essentially run the Lebanese-owned timber and construction sector in Equatorial Guinea. Now, disclaimer, this is by no means a smoking gun or an accusation to anyone. What this presentation should hopefully illuminate is essentially the capacity for this operation to sustain global terror syndicates like Lebanese Hezbollah and the Amal movement from Equatorial Guinean timber resources. And so the three families we have here are the Tikaji families running the firm Kamali, the Majeds that run the company Sofmal, and the Haider clans that aren't necessarily timber traders themselves, but they've essentially managed much of the terrestrial infrastructure that allows the Majeds and the Tikajis to actually make money from their timber operations. And so really, going back to Sofmal, right? One strategy that I'd like to highlight here is economic diversification, right? Because when we talk about timber, we're not just talking about the resource itself, right? We're talking about a diverse set of skills. The Majed family in particular, we have Mohammed, Jamal, and Bassan operating across Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. They've divided their expertise not only across timber extraction, but as well as road construction, because they've actually won at least 3 public tenders to I guess, revitalize the roads that likely border their own concessions and link their concessions in Cameroon as well in Kien Tem province. Now, please excuse any mispronunciation here. Right? So at least what we see here is through diversification, we see a sort of vertical integration of the supply chain where the same group of people can capture multiple opportunities of arbitrage and keep making money out of the same ecosystem, if you will. Now, for the Haiders, right, when we step away from the forest and we look at the transport sector, the Haider clan, we have Hassan, Hichem, and Mohammed based across Bata and Paris in France. They operate the Vintage Group, which in Equatorial Guinea exists as a subsidiary of EGTC, or Equatorial Guinea Trading Company. Now, essentially, EGTC is a multi-industry conglomerate owned by Equatorial or Equatorial Guinean entities, but this particular conglomerate claims on their website to control 70% of the home retail market in Equatorial Guinea, 60% of the frozen food market, 40% of the beverage market, and through the shipping subsidiary Deltamar Agency, processing at least 50% of the incoming ships into either the Bata or Malabo ports. Now, of course, you can see in terms of the location on the far right-hand side, EGTC operates primarily in EG, but also across Central and West Africa. However, it's the firm's Horizon Construction and Vantage point that I'd like to underscore for this case. Because these two companies in particular, while they operate in EG as subsidiaries, their headquarters are actually both based in Beirut, as well as financial offices in Qatar and Dubai. And in fact, Horizon Construction actually, in the past 3 years, won, I want to say, at least 2 public tenders in South Sudan, right? And so in this case, they've been able to remodulate this structure to operate in Equatorial Guinea, responding to the economic and political regulations at hand. Horizon Construction claims to have a prominent stake in building many of the landmarks you see here. And then in particular in terms of, again, demonstrating the capacity for these networks to loop back into drivers of instability like Lebanese Hezbollah, we see EGTC's, I guess, trade flows, if you will. According to transnational databases such as Panjiva, EGTC imports approximately 90% of its products from southern Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And this historically represents the tri-border area of Latin America. That's also home to a very prominent Lebanese diaspora community. And essentially, it's ironic that it's called the tri-border area because it's known by people who live there as a borderless marketplace, right? It's also become infamous for a means of Lebanese Hezbollah financing. Now, again, we're not talking about someone that, you know, raises the flag and says, yes, I'm a general, yes, I'm a leader, but we're talking about a group of families that have revealed the capacity to diversify their economic activity and on their own terms use that liberty, if you will, to fund capital back into the Middle East. Vantage's group, looking back to the subsidiary run by the Haiders, Vantage Group also many of its products flow along the same corridor from the tri-border area, particularly Curitiba in Brazil, and then transshipped either through Point Noir in Republic of Congo or Luanda in Angola, then back to Bata, right? So you have this triangulation of trade that not only reflects history, but also reflects trade flows such as the Tajideens operating out of the DRC that are leaders in Hezbollah financing, right? So again, we're just talking about the capacity, we're talking about the ecosystem and the infrastructure in place, not necessarily a smoking gun. But really, in fact, there could be exposure to the Tajideens, because if we look at EGTC's DRC subsidiary, they actually use the same administrator, the same regulator as several sanctioned entities, particularly Cotrafort, operating in DRC forests. Now, this could mean a number of things, right? Number one, there could just be one person signing all the paperwork in Kinshasa, registering these firms across the food, beverage, and timber industries. Nevertheless, this does demonstrate a potential loophole or potential weakness in regulation for criminal syndicates to actually exploit. And in this case, it is someone as benign as a registrar sitting in Kinshasa. Now, back to banking, right? In order to actually move these products, you also need to move money around, right? Like I referenced earlier, watchdog NGOs in Washington, D.C. have currently highlighted the case of BGFI Bank in the DRC, leveraging personal connections to the Tajideens in the DRC as a way to move money out of Central Africa into the Middle East. BGFI, Banque Gabonais Française Internationale de Guinea Ecuatorial in this case, also has quite personal relations through Abayak, a holding company for the Obiangs, through other prominent Lebanese families operating in Equatorial Guinea. Now, before I digress completely away from timber, this is just, again, proximity, right? We have the Hijajis operating the Middle East and Arab Bank of Lebanon. Qasim Hijaj, highlighted in red, has been designated by the US government as a Hezbollah terrorist financier. He has immediately stepped down, and his son, Ali, has stepped up to the plate as chairman of MEAB Bank. They've co-invested in several multinational real estate ventures with Abayak, obviously owned by the Obiang family. But Hijaj himself also has personal ties, just like the Tajuddins with the Kabila family in the DRC. He also has personal ties with members of the Obiang clan, particularly Alberto Ndong Obiang Lima, President Obiang's son, and the former chief of the ports, right? And again, looping back into timber, the ports, the maritime port, and control over that regulation is a critical component of the timber supply chain, right? It's about moving this product away from Congo Basin forests and into booming consumer markets, not only in East Asia, but also across the rest of the African continent that are experiencing the highest levels of population growth and the highest levels of urbanization. Finally, right, we have among this really diverse, eclectic coterie of actors that are all converging in Equatorial Guinean forests, we have the outlook for destabilization, right? And what I'm talking about is the North Korean firm Chilbo. Now, essentially, right, what seems to be less talked about, right, when my President Trump, unfortunately, is being as dramatic as he can be with Kim Jong-un, I guess what seeps into the shadows of rhetoric is what's going on inside DPRK. And really, DPRK has actually lost half of its forests between 1990 and 2015. And that has wreaked havoc on the country's internal agricultural sector, which further inflames the food insecurity problem facing North Korean leaders. And this has actually come to headwinds in 2012 when Typhoon Balavan actually killed at least 169 people in the DPRK and left 200,000 people homeless. Now, as fragile as that internal political climate is for someone like Kim Jong-un, it's important to make sure that these 200,000 internally displaced persons, if you will, can actually get back to home. And what that requires is demand for inputs like timber. Immediately after the typhoon, President Obiang actually declared that he would be willing to donate up to a million euros as relief aid to North Korea, which merited his winning of that, the Kim Jong-il Award for Human Rights several years ago. Nevertheless, moving beyond 2013, what's really interesting, and again, correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, but as the number of DPRK sanctions against the regime increase from the US, from the UN, from the EU, from Australia, et cetera, the number of DPRK Equatorial Guinea bilateral engagements have skyrocketed, particularly in the last 4 years. And the issue area that seems to come to the forefront is timber and agriculture. Even though in 2015, several state Equatorial Guinean media sources have actually commented that North Korea's Korea Computer Center, which is the DPRK's leading research and development sector for ICT and surveillance, right? They have actually apparently won a $3 billion contract to build up Obiang's IT infrastructure. And not to be completely dramatic, but we are talking about the same level of expertise that did penetrate the Bangladesh Central Bank, that did hack into Sony Pictures, and is also orchestrating quite a unique set of global operations worldwide. Considering that, according to the ITU's Global Cybersecurity Index, how Equatorial Guinea does not score any points on a global ranking of approximately 180 states worldwide, this is a huge opportunity for arbitrage from the eyes of the DPRK. And what we've seen envelop, right? We've seen no other media reporting on this particular contract that's, again, claims to be worth $3 billion. But around that same time, what has been made public, not only from the Equatorial Guinean state, but also from the DPRK's foreign ministry, is an MOU signed that essentially sends an MOU between the ambassador of DPRK to Equatorial Guinea and the Ministry of Forestry from EG that essentially facilitate sending several dozen DPRK students for technical training to EG. Now, whether or not that's true, whether or not that's unfolded, what we've seen is a pretty unapologetic, bifurcated relation where Equatorial Guinea exchanges timber for tech transfers. The range of these tech transfers, again, not being dramatic, but is still unknown. Nevertheless, as I approach 25 minutes, and thank you guys very much for your time, it becomes, as our economy continues to globalize across physical and digital spaces, it's important for us to kind of look beyond the luxury and honor the fact how timber has really become not just a benign resource that constructs our buildings, but actually does reflect a really unique set of geostrategic priorities. And looking at the supply chain, the physical work that comes to actually making this ecosystem profitable provides a really unique foray into that political analysis. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.